Now, it is my joy and privilege to introduce our next speaker. Curtis Childs has been an inspiration as I started watching him on YouTube for, I guess, over a year or two. And he is here to tell us about a great mystic and teacher whom Swedenborg wrote some books, and when I read his book, Life Between Death and Rebirth, the words that Swedenborg wrote were more accurate of my experiences in going between dimensions than anything else I had found written in the world. Curtis is here to say how to make every experience spiritual. When I asked him about his most precious aspiration was to use the knowledge of spirit to improve life for everyone, solving the unsolvable challenges of life. Welcome, Curtis Childs, How to Make Every Experience Spiritual.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. So were you guys here for Jeff's talk just before this? So I want to reference, even if you weren't, there was a point in it where he was talking about his little boy that he lost and getting to hold him again. So I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I was tearing up like everybody else in the back, and there was this feeling of, we say it all the time, but is love, and that this is the most important thing in life. And I'm so like everyone else, traveled to Austin, or maybe you're here, you just traveled down the freeway to get here and hear that and have it be a part of life. But I want to know, it means something. How do you get that everywhere else in life? Because it wasn't necessarily with me at the airport, when I was coming here. So how do you take that and how do you make every experience spiritual? So this is like the very beginning of the speech where it seems like you're like, hey, who's this guy? What does he know anything? What's he talking about? Should I go take a break right now? You're kind of assessing. And if I were you, I would be like, okay, so he's got like a custom background on his slide. He's going to have some kind of presentation. But I would have questions like, we need to define some terms here, right? Because what do I mean? First of all, what I'd be wondering about is that spiritual. Like every experience spiritual seems like a pretty bold claim. And am I going to, because people have such a wide variety of definitions of that word, am I just going to say, well, like everything is already spiritual, so everything is, am I going to try to dodge it like that? So I promise that I'm going to give you a clear definition. Now, spiritual is such a broad thing, and such an important thing, and such a beautiful thing that nobody can nail it down and say, this is exactly what it is. But what I promise that I'm going to do is tell you exactly what I mean when I say spiritual during this talk. But I probably wouldn't even be mostly thinking about that word. I would be thinking about that one. You're going to make every experience spiritual, because there's a lot of experiences. There's the experience of me saying experience right there. There's the experience of me holding this up. There's the experience of me giving too many examples of experiences right now. Are we going to try to micromanage every single thing to make it this profound thing? No, I don't want to try to do that, but I want to try to introduce ways in which we can get what I would call spirituality to permeate enough of life that we're able to solve one of the central problem that I seem to see coming up in spiritual experiences. And this is surrounding spiritual experiences and their application to life. And this is like a relatively complex problem, so I'm going to give you a couple of analogies to try to describe it, just from life as we understand it. The first one is normalizing audio. I don't know if we've ever talked about normalizing audio at an NDE conference, but if you don't know what it is, when you record something in a microphone and you want to play it back in a movie or a video or anything like that, it can't be too loud or too quiet or it doesn't work. I don't know if you've ever had a movie where they don't normalize it very well and there's a part where there's some important dialogue and someone's telling somebody something that means a lot to them, so you turn it up and then something explodes and you wake up the baby, right? So this is an example of that's the audio signal there, then you normalize it, it all falls within the right range. So when we can, as humans, we control the experience to make it something that's enjoyable and manageable. This is also why you have genres of movies. When you say, there's this new movie, somebody can say, what kind of movie is it? And you can tell them, it's a romantic comedy, or it's a drama, or it's a thriller. And usually, unless somebody's trying to do something experimental, it falls neatly within one of those categories. And why is that? Because there's certain flavors that you just can't consume at the same time. You can't have the romantic comedy where it's like, it's whimsical and like, oh, the guy opened this door, but she already opened that door and she's out there. When are they going to meet? They don't know that they're in love yet. And then also there's zombies attacking everyone. You're not going to be able to immerse yourself in that. Or you can't have this really nuanced documentary about the feelings inside of a family and what parenthood means, and the Transformers are smashing everything, right? Because you can't absorb both enough at the same time that you get a full experience. So that's why these are tried and true ways to present it. But that's in the experiences we can control. In life, we don't have that luxury. And it seems to me like there are some flavors that we're supposed to take in at the same time in life that are really, really hard to do. And one of those that might be just about the toughest to reconcile is the difference between this and this. And so what I mean by that is that son is a representative of the near-death experience. And this would be, suddenly you are shown that life is a lot more than you ever thought, that love has more dimensions to it, the potential for human connection and growth, everything is just infinitely more beautiful than you ever knew. All the little interactions we have mean more, the potential for the human family to grow closer. It's all this amazing uplifting, and you try to contrast that with how annoying the rest of life is, or how difficult it can be when you're in traffic and people are cutting you off and people are rude to you. How do you reconcile those two? How did the director get away with making both of those part of the same movie? How did that ever get past the producer, right? And I would argue that this is a dynamic that you don't have to have had a near-death experience to be facing. Because I'm up here, dun dun dun, as someone who has not had near-death experience. But it doesn't mean that I'm not dealing with that same dynamic. Because I think this is something that we deal with according to the spread in which we've experienced it. And I think that the same hurdle you're trying to overcome when you're saying, okay, I've had, and I know from reading quite a lot of near-death experiences that you can have one and life has changed, but it doesn't mean the rest of life is all smoothed out from there on out. There are still all kinds of things people overcome. There's even this phenomenon of like post-near-death experience depression and these sorts of things. So that same feeling of like, I've seen this light, it's impacted me, why isn't everything easy and perfect now, is the same thing that I experience because I haven't had an overt spiritual experience, but I've had a lot of things that felt spiritual to me. That this is times when there's like the same principles that are being described in the near-death experience, that everything is love, that and especially the stuff like there's a plan, and the things you thought aren't taken care of are taken care of. This is stuff that's like really beautiful. There's times when I feel like, of course that's how it is. God is taking care of stuff. I know, it's better to be loving and nice than to be selfish and a jerk, right? I get that. I know how I should be, but I don't always act like that. So why do I fluctuate as well? And that even take all the spiritual stuff out of it. You just like, when you're feeling like, come on, like I shouldn't have lost my temper there. Why do we fluctuate between being really high and being really low? So why does that happen? And it's not just contemporary examples. It's all across spiritual traditions. Very famously, the children of Israel. You know that story, that they're coming out of Egypt, and it starts with this amazing parting of the Red Sea, right? And so everything, God is right there, protecting you going out. But then you just flip a couple chapters, and what's the golden calf is happening, right? Everybody forgot, or the next enemy is coming over the hill, and they're like, well, God's not going to do it this time. So it's in the story for a reason. So this is something that is across experience, across culture, across sacred text, and it's all what I would call the fluctuation, which is why, when I've been somewhere really good, do I not stay there? You don't fluctuate like this with everything. What's that cliche about riding a bike? When you ride a bike, it's like riding a bike because you remember it, right? You get back on a bike, you can still ride a bike. Okay, so riding a bike is kind of cool. I mean, it's a peripheral thing in my life, but I've got that nailed and I'm not going to lose it. How come like living from love and having the true understanding of life, why isn't that like a bike? Like, why can't, it's not like, oh, today I just really can't ride this bike. But with this spiritual stuff, there's just times when I'm like, and I, as they were saying, like I do this little show on YouTube and I try to tell people like, be spiritual, this is how you do it. And I'm not always like that. I'm like, don't I already know this? Aren't everybody? So why are we fluctuating like this? So I'll tell you why. We're fluctuating between what I would call heaven inside us and earth inside us because we're not trying to ditch earth and leave it. We are uniting heaven and earth inside ourselves. And this fluctuation is actually the process by which that happens. And as we pull those two things into alignment, we're not just making ourselves better. And we're not just changing the way that we change the world in our little thing. We're actually providing this amazing anchor between these two sides of reality. So where did I learn that? I mean, what makes me think I can say something like that? I didn't pick it up in business school. But I do want to introduce you to what I would call the 30-year NDE, which is where I have found these amazing tools for life. And you see there, have you guys ever heard of Emanuel Swedenborg? Okay, that's cool. For the rest of you, as you may notice, he's got a wig on and he's painted, which means he's old, right? He's not, like you can't go find him. He doesn't live in Phoenix. This is a guy who's old, but just because he's old doesn't mean there's nothing of value there. That's what I've learned. So I want to introduce you to Swedenborg and why I feel like he's relevant at a Near Death Experience conference and how this is going to help us solve how to make every experience spiritual. But you don't have to take it from me. Let's get an actual scholar to tell you a little bit about it. This is Dr. Jonathan Rose, who's translating Swedenborg right now, and he's just going to give you a quick intro to what the whole thing is.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Rose, series editor of the New Century edition of the works of Emanuel Swedenborg. So maybe you've heard or read something interesting about this Emanuel Swedenborg, and you want to know more. Well, perhaps the most basic thing you should know, just for purposes of light conversation, is that Swedenborg was an 18th century Swedish scientist, philosopher, and theologian. Born 1688, died 1772. The next thing you should probably know is that he was brilliant. He was what people call a universal genius, a polymath, a Renaissance man, ahead of his time. For instance, he was a submarine designer before there was such a thing, a psychologist 140 years before Freud, an aeronautical engineer 190 years before the Wright brothers. He was a mathematician, geologist, metallurgist, mineralogist, crystallographer, anatomist, botanist, chemist, physicist, cosmologist, astronomer. I'm not making this up, this is very well documented. He was an author, inventor, legislator, mining engineer, economist, editor, a poet, and a musician. He came up with the first rational design for flight and made anatomical discoveries that were well ahead of their time. He published 14,000 pages and left another 28,000 pages in manuscript. So he was one of those types. But perhaps the most important but also controversial thing about him was that he claimed that in his mid-50s he had a spiritual awakening that opened the afterlife to him while he was still alive in this world.
I'm sorry, what was that last part? Like I was with you, okay, you did a lot of stuff, you invented some things, that's good. What did you say at the end there? So that was the reaction the scientific community had when Swedenborg, who was, some people called him the last Renaissance man. Like science was at a point when he was doing it where you could know all of it because it wasn't nearly as complex as it is today. And he knew all of it. And he was leading all of these fields. He's doing really well. Like the newspapers would say, Swedenborg is in Amsterdam. He was like a sort of a celebrity there. And like mid-50s started to have the biggest change you can have happen in your life. It began as a series of dreams that he was recording, but very soon, like in spectacular fashion, what do we want to call it now? The veil opened up, and he started having these spiritual experiences, as we would now term them. And this was not just like he had one, but this was for the last 3 decades of his life, every day. And he was cataloging these. He has thousands and thousands of entries in his journal. He was a scientist, so he's used to writing all this stuff down. He described all this stuff. He abandoned, he wasn't publishing scientific work anymore. He's like, I got to tell you all about this spiritual world and the point of life and the way reality works. And isn't this so great? And that's probably why you never heard of him, because he was on track to be like a Newton, but everyone's like, whoa, spirits, angels, like, no thanks, man. So, but he didn't mind. He was like, this is what's important, so I'm going to tell about it. And why? The reason why I'm bringing that to a near-death experience conference is because you guys know Raymond Moody, right? He wrote this book, Life After Life, where he coined the term near-death experience. And in it, he wrote, the correlation between what Swedenborg writes of some of his spiritual experiences and what those who have come back from close calls with death report is amazing. So this was at the end. If you guys haven't read the book, I love that book. And Raymond Moody is saying, look, I found the near-death experience, and it's amazing because you get these reports from all these different people, and while they're all individually different, there's enough similar characteristics that you can categorize them and say these are all part of the same thing. There's something, and so he's looking, I've got this modern phenomenon. What in history is like this? Because if this is a reality people are describing, somebody else must have touched it at some point. So he had these 4 examples of things he felt like in history were really doing the same thing, and Raymond Moody talked about the Bible, he talked about Plato, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and Swedenborg. He had a whole section on Swedenborg. And if you're into Swedenborg like that, you're like, yay, somebody knows who Swedenborg is. So this is why I think, and I've done a lot of near-death experience book reading, which changed my life. I just eternal debt of gratitude to everybody who's had one and talked about one, and you just life is so much better than I thought it would be as described by that. And I think Swedenborg was seeing the very same thing. And he was seeing it methodically, and he could document it. Yeah, as Kenneth Ring, you guys know him, he's in the NDE community, he wrote once in an introduction to a book, people who've had a near-death experience have peeked through the door into the afterlife. Swedenborg explored the whole house. But he does it in this way that's not as, that's very technical. So I feel like it's important to kind of gather data from both. So that's, in case you're wondering why I'm making these claims like, oh, we're uniting heaven and earth and this is how it goes, that's my source material. We won't dwell on it, but we will return every once in a while. Okay, so now, we're back to remember I was talking about the fluctuation before, saying why do we go from being our best self to our worst self, and so often, and no matter what, you cycle back to it. But also, in the beginning, didn't I promise I was going to tell you what I meant by spiritual? Did you forget about that? So I'm making good on that promise. And the reason I've got them both on this slide is because they have to do with each other. Because I described the fluctuation, which hopefully that's something you guys identify with at some level. But I'm describing the effects of it. Like, this is how it feels to fluctuate between, the feeling when someone is telling their near-death experience here, and you're like, yeah, that's what life is, and then the feeling in the lobby when you're like, wow, why did that person cut in front of me in line? That's the fluctuation. What are we fluctuating between? What causes those symptoms? And I would say that we're fluctuating between thinking spiritually and thinking materialistically. And the definition of thinking spiritually, and this is actually lifted right out of Swedenborg's book, one of the new translations of it, and I actually really love this definition. Thinking spiritually is to think about actual things as they really are. Which is interesting, because you might think, thinking spiritually about something is, think about it positively, or it's esoteric and it has purple near it, but he's saying, thinking spiritually is just thinking about what's up. And if you think about the whole NDE phenomenon, this is not people saying, I found out a really good story to tell around death, or I found out a way to make peace with death. They're telling you, I observed what's happening, and actually things are beautiful, right? So contrast that with thinking materialistically, which is to think about things as they appear. So what do I mean by things as they appear? I'm going to give you what I feel like are some really concrete examples, and this one starts just entirely on the physical level. Let's talk about the earth and the sun. There's a very famous appearance that caused some headaches for Galileo. What is it? That the sun is going around the earth, right? We now know that, no, we're orbiting the sun. But if you just step outside and look, if you don't have knowledge, it looks like the sun's going around the earth. That's the appearance. If nobody had ever built a telescope or a spaceship and found out ways to find that out, that's how it looks. So it appears, and also, not just that, how big is the sun? I don't know, it could be pretty big, but 100 miles across? I don't know, it depends on how high it is, but it's not as big as the Earth. You look out at the Earth is huge, right? But now we know that there's millions of Earths could fit inside the sun. That's just an appearance. And also, how far away is the sun? I don't know, maybe It's higher than the clouds, I can tell. It's probably not that. It's probably 1,000 miles away. It's 93 million miles away. But you don't see that from the appearance. So do you get what I'm saying? Appearance versus how it really is. So that's just on the physical level. But let's talk about death. So what's the difference between thinking about death as it appears and death as it really is? Because having not had a near-death experience, I can tell you, but having seen death, it looks, when you see it, like death is the end. I mean, because you think about, we got these people, and we love them, and we know them through their bodies. I mean, that's the only way you've ever interacted with them. They have faces and eyes, and these things tell you what's going on. You hug the body. And when death comes around, it's not happening anymore. And you look around for that, the body stops doing what you're used to. You look around for them. You don't see them anymore. It looks like that's it. That's the appearance. That, like Howard was saying, switch off. That's the end of life. And it looks like the death process is this horrific thing. It looks painful. People get incoherent. They're losing touch with reality. It seems like it's this lonely thing. And that's the end. That's the materialistic side. But I don't need to tell you guys, if you've been at this conference, what's it actually like? The near-death experience, when you see what's actually happening, is that death is this freeing, amazing, continuing, vivid experience where you're learning these amazing things, and the person isn't gone. The person is more there than they've ever been, and that's not the end of life. And those people that are starting to seem like they're out of touch with reality, talking to people who aren't in the room, are like more in touch with reality than we are. So do you see what, so that's thinking spiritually or thinking materialistically about death. And it's not put a good interpretation on. It's just if you have the whole story, then it's beautiful. That's why with thinking spiritually, with spirituality, there is this love in it, and there is this beauty and this comfort, because the way that life actually is beautiful. It is comforting, okay? So that's an example that we've got at the Near Death Experience Conference. But if we're going to make any progress in this fluctuation to the rest of life, we can apply this same thinking spiritually thinking materialistically to anything. Right? So how about people? Do we always think spiritually about people? Do we have a tendency to think via appearances about people? I know that that's kind of my default. You have this, you're hardwired to think based on the appearance that you're in. And that's a little bit strange sounding, but an example is, let's say I was here and somebody walks out while I'm talking. To me, it seems like they just disappear when that door closes and they're gone, because I'm the center of reality, right? So they go. That's just the appearance, but actually they have a whole reality that's going out there, and it's like, phew, I'm glad I got out of that speech, or whatever. There's a ton of appearances around people, and this leads into my favorite thing that I learned in college. There's no offense to everything else I learned in college, but it's called the fundamental attribution error. And it's called fundamental because we do it so often we don't even know we're doing it, but it basically works like this. Let's go back to our traffic metaphor. You're in traffic, somebody cuts you off. Can you believe it? They cut you off, and versus you cut somebody off. Well, when you cut somebody off, what do you say? You're like, oh, I didn't see them there. I was looking at this other car that's sort of merging in. That was distracting me. I've been dealing with a lot of stuff recently. I wouldn't usually do that. When somebody else cuts you off, why did they cut you off? Because they're a jerk. Because they're selfish, because they don't care, they think they own the world. So the fundamental attribution error is, when we do it, it's circumstances. When they do it, it's character traits. It's because of who they are. And you know what that is? That's an appearance. Because like it or not, it just seems like everyone's less real than us. Everybody doesn't have as much of a backstory. Everybody doesn't have as much complexity. Everybody doesn't have enough good reasons, because we spend so much time in ourselves and we know our story. So that's thinking materialistically about people, and it gets us into a lot of problems. I want to figure out, how do you think spiritually about people? But I want to put that on hold for a second, because we've got to finish up with this fluctuation thing. Because we've all had moments of thinking spiritually about people. Right? Maybe you get them at a near-death experience conference. Maybe you just have a second where you realize, wow, all these people have real lives. You're on the road and you realize, I'm trying to get to my exit. Everybody else has an exit and people that they're trying to get to. I love this saying, you're not in traffic, you are traffic. But I'm in this terrible traffic right now. The guy behind you are traffic. So we've known it. We know that that's what people are, but why don't we stay there? Why do I keep going in and out of really seeing things how they are? Why is it like there's almost like these two parts of me? And that's because, according to Swedenborg, there are two parts of us. There's what he calls the inner and the outer self. And there's a lot you could go into around that, but the key distinction, and this is two parts of, not like your outer self is your body and your inner self is your mind or spirit. I'm talking about two parts of your consciousness, right, that are distinct from each other. And the distinction that's important for today's talk is that the inner self thinks spiritually, it's native to that, and the outer self thinks materialistically. That's what it does. It's centered in this world. That might seem like obscure and not comforting or anything, but to me this is hugely comforting, because suddenly it's not like, what's wrong with me? Why was I so spiritual when I was giving my presentation this morning, and then later today I'm not spiritual at all? It's not, you're in your inner self, which is spiritual, and then you're in the outer self. And it's not like you're trying to ditch the outer self, or it's not useful, this practical part of you. You're trying to get them into alignment, right? And that this is, the fluctuation is what's pulling these two things together. And I would note that this fluctuation, this process of going from high to low, extends very much into the world of near-death experiences. Because first of all, I mean, think about what a near-death experience is. You have this horrific event, usually, to start, where things seem, you're almost more in the materialistic appearance view there than ever, because life seems, whatever it is, whatever you're in an accident or there's some life-threatening thing, and everything seems really bad. Like life seems that you feel more alone than you ever have. Life seems limited. It seems like there's no help, right? You get all the way into this world of terror, and then you get pulled right out into this extreme love and light, and it's all different. You have this major fluctuation. And why is there that initial part to it, right? Why do you go from this all the way down? Why isn't it just like you're walking around, things are really good that day, you found the best parking spot, you got somebody gave you a free breakfast, and then you have your experience. Why isn't it that? Even within the near-death experience, you think about Howard Storm's other experiences that have this dark element to it, this extra fluctuation. It's not just good enough to go from life to way up here, then you go back down, and then you're saved out of that. This is so vividly present there, but even then, you're up there, you learn all this stuff, it's so great, then what? You're back in the body, and usually in for a miserable recovery. There's a fluctuation again. Right? So this fluctuation is everywhere, and Swedenborg wrote that this vacillating is essential to our spiritual growth. And that's why it's showing up. This is from his book, Secrets of Heaven. He says, the whole process of rebirth exists in order for us to receive new life. So when our previous way of life breaks down in times of trouble, we cannot help faltering between truth and falsity after the trouble has passed. I would substitute spiritual and materialistic thinking. Truth belongs to the new life, falsity to the old. So I've learned this new stuff about reality. This is my new life, but my outer self has not gotten the memo, and it's still there because it learns a lot slower, and it's very hostile to anything that interrupts its view of the world. Unless the earlier way of life is destroyed and this uncertainty takes hold, spiritual seed cannot possibly be sown in us, since there is no soil for it. So why is there so much disruption in these near-death experience stories before it happens? Could it be that we kind of walk around in this outer self shell, and only when we have to, when that gets rattled somehow, I love that phrase, spiritual seed gets sown in, can we get to the next thing? So I want to read one more quote about this, and this has to do with the way this invites heaven into our mind. It says, the Lord has foreseen and arranged matters in such a way that the more we derive our thoughts and intentions from heaven, the more our inner spiritual self opens and takes shape. This is an opening to heaven all the way to the Lord, and taking shape in accord with the priorities of heaven. The headline to me there is, the more we derive our thoughts and intentions from heaven. So he's describing that the stuff that it doesn't have to be in a spiritual experience, the stuff that is those principles, the thinking spiritually about life is not just like it's like heaven. This is heaven coming in and somehow working through your mechanism. So how do we get it? We got this fluctuation where you're going from heaven's in the mind to whatever else is in the mind. How do we get it? And I'm telling you that that's not ever going to totally go away because we're meant to be aligning these two things. But how do we get it so that we're not going from here to here, we're going from like here to here? How do we get it so that we're pulling things more in a spiritual direction? And if it's going to happen, it's got to be according to some kind of order. Look at everything else in life. This is how an embryo forms. Everything's got this structure and steps, and you can't just skip a step. You can't just say, let's get right to the baby, because there's no structure, there's no baby, right? Just because something's spiritual doesn't mean it has, if this world is part of the same machine, why is it so structured, but the other world wouldn't be? So there's the same kind of structure, and I think that's why near-death experience people come back. Well, part of it, I mean, it's not like they know better than I do, but part of it is like, even though we can pull you out for a little while, there's still some stuff that's got to happen in this process before you're ready to really be born. So I want to just quickly teach you how to think like an angel. This is pulled, like I said, Swedenborg was having discourse with what he called them angels. You can use the term that you would like. But where this is back to how do you think spiritually about people? Right, because we know how to think spiritually about death. How do you think spiritually about people? So this is how angels think about people. And if we can, my premise is, if we can load more of the reality of everything into our minds, the less we fluctuate out of, because we might know how to deal with death, but we don't know how to deal with a person who is being annoying. So, very briefly, we think of a person like a pool. All their characteristics and things are in them, and they did something terrible. I didn't know they had it in them. Right? And maybe people can drop rocks in that pool, but in general, that's who they are. According to angels, actually, we're a confluence, which that's a term people use for when two rivers meet up. And there's this great meeting in all of us of the higher and the lower. And Swedenborg was able to see this very vividly, and that we're constantly being pressed on by what is good and what is harmful. And each one is trying to express itself through us, trying to almost like recruit. And knowing that, to me, when I look at somebody and they do something that bothers me, instead of saying like, what a jerk, instead of making the fundamental attribution error, I'm like, the bad river got him that time, And this is, I could give 40 talks about this and what it means to me, but hopefully that's a tangible idea. And that is the only way to account for human behavior without going nuts. So, person confluence. And Swedenborg, I want to read this little quote, and he uses the H word, hell, in here, and that could be another presentation because he does talk about heaven and hell, but he talks about them as mindsets. It's very much along the lines of some of the things we've been hearing here. We won't go into it, but just for hell here, think about anybody who is making harmful actions their priority and the love of their life. When angels think and speak about the hells, then, they think and speak about falsity and evil in the abstract, separate from hell's inhabitants. Angels always set aside any thought of the person, staying with the thought of the thing itself. So welcome to Swedenborg. It's like, just what's he talking about? What I pull out of that is, instead of saying like, man, those people who love evil stuff are messed up, those people are a problem, the problem is the harmful behavior. And an angel can always see like, what would you be like without that? It doesn't matter how much you think that that's you, what would you be like without that? And if we are able to think of people like this confluence, we get to this, we can open up space for an imperative, which is sort of the next way to think about people, which is, I want this person to be even happier than I am. And it doesn't mean, right, you become a doormat and you make everyone else, but there's something in, when we approach a person, generally, what do? We like evaluate how much of a threat are they to me, what do they mean to me, are they in my way? But instead, the angelic way to think is like, this person has an opportunity to make happy. And that might seem, it doesn't seem that strange, but it seems a little bit like Can you really operate that way? Well, that is heaven. Swedenborg says, heaven is wishing better for others than for ourselves with all our heart, and serving others for the sake of their own happiness, not for any selfish goal, but for love. And I know there's all these details and specifics about wait, but you got to love yourself first, and you got to make sure, yes. But the goal, like for example, I'm up here giving a speech. There are two very different ways I can be giving this speech. One is like, how cool can I make people think I am, right? If I give a good speech, if I have like slides, how much can this speech serve me, right? How much can it make it so people will watch my YouTube channel, that sort of stuff. The other one is, am I trying to give you something that when you walk out of this room and you go get lunch and you go home, something made a difference for you, right? It doesn't mean I have to say like, oh, I'm so much worse than everyone or whatever, but the point is the impact. That's what we're doing. So that's what I see in that. Then the final way that you can look at people is, and this is not very poetic, this person has an eternal function. Not just that this person is going to live forever, which I think is true, but this person is going to be forever contributing more and more to life. So this is just a 3.5-minute video. I think, okay. And this is that we made describing the depiction of the essence of heaven, as Swedenborg describes it. And that actually, you think about heaven, what is this thing? And it's got to be something that can't be that alien to us. Well, actually, like, we're all wearing copies of it. If you look at the human body, it is a model of the heaven mindset. Because just think about the way, not the shape of it, but the function in it. And think about the community of organs and cells, and everything is entirely giving to the whole and entirely receiving from the whole. And there's all kinds of distinction and diversity in there, but there's a common goal, right? So this is a little description of how heaven is like the human race working towards that goal. So that's trying to, hopefully that made sense, that we're trying to describe that it's a community of function, that everybody not just can live and be happy, but can contribute, and contribute in a way that nobody else can. That somebody is going to be getting, think about the people that have helped you the most. Think about if you needed surgery and somebody, how glad you are that they're good at doing what they do. Somebody, imagine that everybody you meet has the potential to be this amazing helper, and that's their destiny. I mean, this is what God is trying to pull everybody towards, is to be this contributing partner in this thing. To try to think of somebody as that, just like, okay, cool. So right now, you are cutting me off on the road, but someday I want to be so glad about what you're doing for the human race. So that's what we're trying to do, is learn about reality. None of that stuff is, Swedenborg is reporting this as reality, the NDE are reporting this as reality. None of this is like, let's put a happy spin on life. It's like, let's see what life really is. Because when you're out of the appearance and into the sight, it's good. And that's hopefully going to lead to a happier existence. And that's how we make every experience spiritual. I have a workshop later today. I would try to give you the most potent one, which is how you think about people. I'm going to talk in the workshop about, so how can everything else you see be a reminder? So there's this fascinating concept that even the way the world is built, the way light reacts with things, the way sound works, the way trees and animals are, if you know how to read it right, this is reminding us of spiritual things. And then also, what about your job? We've spent a lot of time at work. Is it only outside at conferences like this that we can get it? But there's a way that actually going and working can be this plugging into this spiritual. And then finally, we could talk more about angels and how when you're not having some kind of overt experience where you can talk to them as beings and see them, how are you actually feeling heaven in you and you don't realize it? And how can you make it so that happens more? Thanks. This is one last quote that I'll leave you with. We need to know as well that it is humankind through which the natural world is united to the spiritual world, and that we are the means of the union, for there is within us a natural world and also a spiritual world. So we're like a miniature picture, a microcosm of the whole. So to the extent that we are spiritual, we are a means of union. So when you're there and you're hungry and you're tired and it's not your day and you're in your outer self and you're working to just teach it the basic things of how to pull it in, know that you are doing an awesome thing, and it's something that we're all trying to do, and it seems like it's something you're trying to work around, but it might actually be the core of what we're trying to do here. This has been a lot of fun talking. Thanks so much for giving me a chance. Thank you.